The gentle hum of the car's engine filled the quiet afternoon as Mrs. Lee drove home from her doctor's appointment. Her hand rested protectively on her growing belly, now 8 months along with her first child. The late autumn rain tapped softly against the windshield as she carefully navigated the suburban streets she'd called home for the past 5 years. At 34, Mrs. Lee had built a comfortable life here with her husband, Mr. Thompson. While she worked as a talented graphic designer, her husband had made a name for himself as one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys. His recent work had focused on bridging the widening gap between law enforcement and the local community, a tension that had been slowly building over the past year. Their neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes, had always been a peaceful place. Yet lately, things had started to change. Residents at community meetings spoke in hushed tones about traffic stops that lasted too long, about questions that felt too pointed, about treatment that seemed to vary depending on the color of one's skin. Mr. Thompson had taken notice, carefully documenting each incident, building relationships with community members, and working through proper channels to address these concerns. Mrs. Lee thought about her husband's dedication as she drove, proud of how he managed to stay professional and solution-focused even when faced with resistance. He always said that lasting change came through persistent, methodical work, not through heated confrontations. She smiled, thinking about how their child would grow up seeing this example of working for positive change in their community. The rain was falling harder now, and Mrs. Lee slowed down even further, squinting slightly through the street windshield. Her doctor had warned her to take things easy, especially now in the final stretch of her pregnancy. She'd had a good checkup today. The baby was healthy, growing right on schedule. They'd even gotten a new ultrasound picture, which she couldn't wait to show her husband. As she turned onto Oak Street, just 2 blocks from home, she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart rate picked up slightly. She was certain she'd been driving carefully, following all traffic rules to the letter. Still, she did exactly what her husband had always advised: stay calm, be polite, and remember your rights. She pulled over smoothly, positioning her car well out of traffic's way. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as she took a deep breath, placing both hands visible on the steering wheel. Through her side mirror, she could see 2 officers approaching her car, moving with a purpose that made her slightly uneasy. Little did she know that this routine traffic stop was about to escalate into something that would shake their community to its core and test everything her husband had been working toward. The next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would expose long-hidden problems within the local police department and ultimately lead to changes that would ripple far beyond their suburban neighborhood. The first raindrops slipped through her slightly cracked window as one of the officers approached, his face set in a stern expression that made Mrs. Lee's stomach tighten with worry. She reminded herself to stay calm, thinking of her baby, thinking of her husband's words about maintaining composure in tense situations. But something in the officer's eyes told her this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop, and she was right, though she couldn't have imagined just how much this moment would change everything. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. Mrs. Lee nodded politely, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. The rain was getting heavier, drops now steadily falling through the partially open window, dampening her sleeve. "I pulled you over for making an illegal turn back there," the officer stated, though Mrs. Lee was certain she followed all traffic rules. She kept her voice steady as she replied, "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm quite sure I signaled properly and made a legal turn." The second officer, who had been standing back, now stepped forward. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Mrs. Lee's heart began to race. "Officers, I'm 8 months pregnant. I have my medical documents right here, and I just came from my doctor's appointment. Could you please?" I said, "Step out of the vehicle." The second officer cut her off, his tone growing harsher. "We don't need your life story. Follow instructions, or this will get complicated." Fighting back tears, Mrs. Lee carefully opened her door. The rain immediately soaked through her clothes as she struggled to maintain her balance, one hand protectively cradling her belly. The officers made no move to help her or offer any shelter from the downpour. "We're going to search your vehicle," the first officer announced. "Stand over there by the patrol car." Mrs. Lee tried once more to reason with them. "Please, I'm getting soaked, and my doctor said I need to avoid stress. Could I at least wait under some cover?" "You should have thought about that before giving us attitude," the second officer sneered. "You people always think you're above the law." The comment stung, its meaning crystal clear. Mrs. Lee felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as passing cars slowed to watch the scene unfold. The officers took their time searching her car, methodically going through every compartment, leaving her medical papers and personal belongings scattered across the wet seats. All the while, Mrs. Lee stood shivering in the rain, watching as her neighbors peeked through their windows at the unfolding scene. Mrs. Lee's legs were starting to shake from standing so long when she finally worked up the courage to speak again. "Officers, please. I'm feeling lightheaded. My husband is a local attorney. Could I please call him?" This seemed to catch their attention, but not in the way she'd hoped. "Oh, so now we're throwing around connections?" the first officer mocked. "Let me guess, he's some hotshot who's going to make trouble for us." With trembling hands, Mrs. Lee managed to pull out her phone. Despite the officer's intimidating stares, she dialed her husband's number. As it rang, she could hear them muttering between themselves, their attitudes shifting slightly at the mention of a lawyer, but their hostility remained palpable. The officers continued their unnecessary search, now moving slower, as if deliberately prolonging her discomfort. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at a distance, some openly recording with their phones. Mrs. Lee could hear whispers of concern and outrage, but no one dared to intervene. Just then, her husband's voice came through the phone. Through chattering teeth, she managed to explain the situation. His response was calm but firm. "Don't say another word. I'm on my way with a colleague. Keep your phone recording and try to stay strong." The officers overheard the conversation, exchanging glances that mixed concern with defiance. They clearly hadn't expected their routine harassment to attract legal attention, but instead of backing down, they seemed determined to assert their authority while they still could. Little did they know that their actions in the next few minutes would not only be thoroughly documented, but would also become the catalyst for changes that would reshape the entire department. The sound of approaching cars in the distance signaled that this confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. A sleek black car pulled up to the scene, followed closely by another. Mr. Thompson stepped out, umbrella in hand, his face a mask of controlled composure. Behind him emerged his colleague, an experienced civil rights attorney known for handling police misconduct cases. The sight of these two respected legal professionals immediately changed the atmosphere. Mr. Thompson's first concern was his wife. He rushed to her side, sheltering her with his umbrella while quickly assessing her condition. She was soaked to the bone, shivering, her face pale with stress and exhaustion. The neighbor who had been recording everything quickly approached, offering her jacket and showing Mr. Thompson the footage she'd captured. "What seems to be the problem here, officers?" Mr. Thompson's voice was steady but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. The officers, who moments ago had been so aggressive, now stood straighter, their expressions shifting between uncertainty and lingering defiance. "Routine traffic stop," the first officer replied stiffly. "We observed an illegal turn." The second officer added, "The driver was uncooperative." Mr. Thompson's colleague was already circling the scene, taking photos and gathering statements from witnesses. The neighbors, who had watched helplessly as the situation unfolded, now stepped forward one by one, eager to share what they had seen. "I saw the whole thing," spoke up an elderly resident who lived on the corner. "That young lady made a perfect turn. Used her signal and everything. Been watching this intersection from my porch for 20 years, and I know what I saw." Another neighbor, a high school teacher, stepped forward. I started recording when I saw them make her stand in the rain. She told them multiple times about her pregnancy. I heard everything through my open window. Mr. Thompson listened carefully to each account while keeping a protective arm around his wife. Her breathing had become labored, and he could feel her trembling against him. His colleague had already called for medical assistance, knowing the potential risks of this level of stress on a late-stage pregnancy. The officers, realizing the situation had spiraled far beyond their control, attempted to regain some authority. "We were just doing our jobs," the first officer insisted, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. If she had simply complied. She did comply, interrupted a teenage witness, phone still recording. "I have the whole thing on video." They didn't even let her explain about her doctor's appointment. An ambulance arrived, its lights casting red and blue reflections in the puddles gathering on the street. The paramedics quickly moved to attend to Mrs. Lee, their concerned expressions deepening as they checked her vital signs. One of them shook his head disapprovingly at the sight of her drenched clothes and stressed condition. Mr. Thompson turned to the officers, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legal expertise. "Your badge numbers and names, please. Also, I trust your body cameras have been active this entire time." The officers shifted uncomfortably, knowing that every moment of their misconduct had been captured from multiple angles. More police cars began arriving at the scene, including a sergeant who had been alerted to the situation. The original officer's demeanor changed yet again as their superior approached, their earlier arrogance replaced by growing concern as they realized the full implications of their actions. The gathering crowd had grown larger, with more neighbors emerging from their homes despite the rain. Many were filming, others were offering statements, and all were witnessing a powerful moment of community solidarity. What these officers had intended as a display of authority had instead become a revelation of their abuse of power, captured in undeniable detail. As the paramedics helped Mrs. Lee onto a stretcher, Mr. Thompson knew this incident would mark a turning point. His years of working for police reform had just gained a powerful personal dimension. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were many, and the time for meaningful change had finally arrived. The following days unfolded with a whirlwind of activity. Mr. Thompson sat in his office early morning, surrounded by witness statements, medical reports, and video footage from multiple angles. His wife was home resting under doctor's orders, her blood pressure still higher than it should be for someone so far along in pregnancy. The body camera footage just came in, his colleague announced, walking into the office with a USB drive. They had filed an immediate request for the footage, knowing every second of the encounter would be crucial. As they watched the video, the officer's behavior appeared even worse than initially reported. The cameras had picked up every dismissive comment, every ignored plea about the pregnancy, and most importantly, captured clear evidence that there had been no traffic violation to justify the stop. The officers' own cameras had recorded their conversation before the stop, revealing they had targeted Mrs. Lee's car for no legitimate reason. Community support poured in from unexpected places. The elderly neighbor who had witnessed the incident turned out to be a retired police surgeon himself. "In my 30 years on the force, this isn't what we stood for," he stated firmly, providing a written statement that carried extra weight given his background. The high school teacher who had recorded the incident shared how this had affected her students. "They're watching us," she explained during her official statement. "They're watching to see if justice is possible, if standing up against wrongdoing actually makes a difference." Local news stations began picking up the story. At first, the police department tried to minimize the incident, releasing a brief statement about investigating the matter internally. But as more videos surfaced on social media and community pressure mounted, they couldn't maintain their defensive stance. Mr. Thompson received an unexpected call from a police officer who worked in the same precinct as the two officers involved. "This isn't the first time," the officer revealed, speaking quietly as if worried about being overheard. "There's been other incidents, but people were too scared to come forward. I can't stand by anymore." The hospital records told their own story. Mrs. Lee's doctor wrote a detailed report about the stress-induced complications, including elevated blood pressure and signs of potential early labor that required monitoring. Each medical document added another layer to the case, showing the real human cost of the officer's actions. Community leaders began organizing peaceful gatherings to support the family and call for change. They weren't just angry protests. People shared their own stories, offered solutions, and expressed their hopes for better relationships between police and citizens. The gatherings drew people from all walks of life, united in their desire for accountability and reform. The Teenage Witnesses video had gone viral, drawing attention from civil rights organizations across the country. Each new view and share added pressure on the department to take real action. The clear footage of a visibly pregnant woman being forced to stand in the rain, while officers needlessly searched her car, sparked outrage far beyond their local community. Mr. Thompson worked methodically, building a case that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just filing a complaint. He was pushing for systematic changes in training, accountability, and department culture. His wife's experience had become a catalyst for addressing long-standing issues that affected the entire community. As he organized the growing stack of evidence on his desk, Mr. Thompson received another call. It was from the police chief's office, requesting a meeting. The tide was turning, but he knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require more than just disciplining 2 officers. It would mean transforming an entire system. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. His wife's horrible experience could lead to policies that would protect countless others in the future. Sometimes, he realized, it took one clear, undeniable incident to open everyone's eyes to a problem that had been there all along. The police department's initial response was predictable. A carefully worded press release full of official language, but saying very little. Words like investigating thoroughly and taking all concerns seriously did nothing to calm the growing public outrage. But behind the scenes, things were starting to crack. Internal Affairs couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence. The body camera footage was damning enough, but when combined with multiple citizen videos, medical reports, and the officer's own conflicting statements, it painted a picture of serious misconduct. More importantly, it wasn't an isolated incident. "You need to see this," said Mr. Thompson's colleague, bringing in a stack of newly received documents. Other residents had started coming forward, describing similar experiences with the same officers. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested these officers had been targeting minorities and vulnerable people for months. The whistleblower officer from the precinct proved invaluable. He provided dates, times, and incident numbers that helped track down more cases. They thought nobody would believe these people, he explained during a confidential meeting. They picked their targets carefully, people they thought wouldn't fight back. The police chief's meeting with Mr. Thompson lasted 3 hours. What started as an attempt to smooth things over turned into a frank discussion about deep-rooted problems. The chief, a 30-year veteran, seemed genuinely shaken by the evidence. "This isn't what I want my department to be," he admitted, his usual confidence replaced by concern. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee's story had touched a nerve in the community. People gathered outside the police station, holding peaceful vigils. They brought photos of their own pregnant wives, sisters, and daughters. Signs asked simple but powerful questions. Would you treat your daughter this way? And what if this was your wife? The department's own records betrayed them. The 2 officers had received multiple complaints before, but each had been dismissed without proper investigation. The Internal Affairs detective who made this discovery looked troubled. "We missed this," he said, reviewing the files. "We should have seen the patterns sooner." Local politicians couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The city council called an emergency meeting. One by one, residents stepped up to the microphone, sharing their experiences. The elderly former surgeon's testimony hit particularly hard. "I helped build this department," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What I saw that day destroyed decades of community trust. The officers involved finally faced questioning. Their stories didn't match the video evidence, and they contradicted each other on key points. Their superior, reviewing the footage, shook his head in dismay. "This isn't what we trained them to do," he muttered, but everyone knew the real question was how they had been allowed to continue for so long. Support for Mrs. Lee came from unexpected places. Other police officers' wives reached out, expressing their horror at how she'd been treated. "My husband's a cop," one wrote, "and he was disgusted by what they did to you. This isn't what good policing looks like." The internal investigation moved surprisingly quickly, pushed along by public pressure and the undeniable evidence. The chief held a private meeting with the department's senior officers, where he played the complete footage. The room fell silent as they watched their colleagues' behavior, the shame and anger palpable. Mr. Thompson kept working, even as his wife's due date approached. Every new piece of evidence, every testimony strengthened the case for major reforms. The department's defensive wall was crumbling, replaced by an uncomfortable realization that real change was needed. As the fifth day of investigations ended, the police chief made an unprecedented move. Instead of the usual private disciplinary hearing, he announced there would be a public statement. The community held its breath, wondering if this time would be different, if real change was finally possible. The community center was packed for the police chief's public statement. News cameras lined the back wall, and every seat was filled. Mr. Thompson sat in the front row, his phone ready to record everything. His wife watched the live stream from home, following doctor's orders to avoid stressful situations. The police chief stepped up to the podium, looking different from his usual confident self. He cleared his throat and began not with prepared remarks, but with something unexpected. "First, I want to apologize. Not just as a police chief, but as a father and a member of this community." The room fell silent as he continued, "We've seen the videos. We've reviewed the evidence. What happened to Mrs. Lee was wrong. But it's not enough to just say it was wrong. We need to make sure it never happens again." His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights wrestling with hard truths. He announced that both officers had been suspended without pay, pending termination proceedings. But more importantly, he revealed that a full department audit would begin immediately. "We're bringing in independent investigators," he explained. "They'll have complete access to all our records, all our procedures, everything." The local media couldn't get enough of the story. A news reporter interviewed the teenage witness whose video had gone viral. "I just did what I hoped someone would do for my mom," the teenager said simply. "When you see something wrong, you can't just scroll past it." The police union usually defended officers automatically, but this time was different. "We protect good cops," the union representative stated. "What happened here doesn't represent the officers we stand for." This unusual stance showed just how clear-cut the misconduct had been. Other pregnant women began sharing their own stories of feeling vulnerable during police encounters. A young mother described being terrified during a traffic stop, wondering if she'd be treated the same way. These stories highlighted how deeply the incident had affected public trust. The whistleblower officer received both praise and criticism from colleagues. Some called him a traitor, but others quietly thanked him. "We got into this job to help people," one veteran officer told him. "Sometimes helping means speaking up when things go wrong." Mr. Thompson's law office became a hub of activity. Other lawyers offered to help pro bono, seeing this as a chance to create lasting change. They weren't just building a case. They were drafting new policies that could protect future generations. The high school teacher who had recorded the incident used it as a teaching moment. Her students discussed civil rights, civic duty, and the power of standing up for others. "This isn't just about one incident," she told her class. "It's about the kind of community we want to be." Local businesses showed their support in simple but meaningful ways. The cafe near the courthouse offered free coffee to people attending the community meetings. A print shop made signs for the peaceful gatherings at no charge. Small gestures that showed the community united for change. The police department's internal investigation uncovered more problems than anyone expected. Years of overlooked complaints, ignored warning signs, and missed opportunities for intervention. Each discovery strengthened the case for major reforms. As the evening news covered the latest developments, the elderly former surgeon summed it up best. Sometimes it takes one clear example to show us what we've been letting slide for too long. Now we have a choice. Do we really fix it, or do we just put a Band-Aid on it and hope nobody notices? The legal proceedings began on a crisp morning, with media trucks lining the courthouse steps. Mr. Thompson wasn't just representing his wife anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever felt powerless during a police encounter. His opening statement was simple but powerful. This isn't about punishing individuals. It's about fixing a broken system. The courtroom fell silent as the body camera footage played on the large screen. Even those who had seen it before winced at the clear disregard for Mrs. Lee's condition. The judge, a normally stoic figure, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes several times during the viewing. "Could you walk us through what happened next?" Mr. Thompson asked the whistleblower officer, now on the witness stand. The officer's testimony was devastating. He described years of similar incidents, swept under the rug with paperwork and excuses. His voice shook slightly, but his resolve was clear. The department's training officer testified about gaps in their procedures. "We teach them about proper conduct," she admitted, "but there were no real consequences for breaking the rules." Her honesty about systemic failures added another crucial piece to the puzzle. Outside the courthouse, community members gathered peacefully. They weren't angry protesters. They were families, teachers, business owners, all standing together for change. A pregnant woman held a sign that read, "Will my child grow up in a better world?" The image made headlines across the country. The officers' disciplinary hearing ran parallel to the civil case. Their excuses fell flat against the mountain of evidence. "We were just following procedure," one claimed, but couldn't point to any procedure that justified their actions. Their own body camera footage contradicted their statements time and time again. Medical experts testified about the risks their actions had posed. "Stress can trigger serious complications in late pregnancy," the doctor explained. They turned a routine stop into a potentially dangerous situation. Her professional assessment carried significant weight with the review board. The city council members watched the proceedings closely. They knew this case would set precedents for years to come. One councilwoman, a former teacher, spoke up during a public meeting. "We're not just judging past actions. We're deciding what kind of police force we want for our future." Mr. Thompson received support from unexpected allies. A group of police officers' spouses submitted a letter backing the reforms. "Our partners risked their lives to protect people," they wrote. "That's why we can't stay silent when officers abuse their power." The evidence phase revealed more than just individual misconduct. Internal emails showed a pattern of dismissing complaints, especially from minority residents. Each revelation strengthened the case for department-wide changes. Back home, Mrs. Lee focused on staying healthy for their baby. The community rallied around her. Neighbors brought meals, offered support, and showed that the best of humanity often shines through during difficult times. Her strength through all this touched many hearts. The judge, reviewing years of department records, found a disturbing trend. Similar incidents had been reported before, but the complaints disappeared into a bureaucratic maze. His questions during the proceedings showed he understood this was about more than one traffic stop. As the legal proceedings continued, something unexpected happened. Officers from other districts started coming forward, sharing their own concerns about training and accountability. What began as one case was becoming a movement for change from within the system itself. The department's transformation began with small but significant changes. The first sign appeared on a Monday morning. New training schedules posted in every precinct. Not the usual boring presentations, but real sessions led by community members, medical professionals, and civil rights experts. Officers sat in these training rooms, some skeptical at first, others openly eager for change. A doctor explained the risks of stress during pregnancy, showing them exactly why their actions could have serious consequences. "This isn't just about following rules," she said. "It's about understanding how your actions affect real people." The retired surgeon who had witnessed the original incident became a regular trainer. His decades of experience gave him credibility with younger officers. "Good policing isn't about power," he would tell them. "It's about protecting people, all people, even when it's inconvenient." The whistleblower officer, initially feared as a traitor, found more colleagues quietly supporting him. During lunch breaks, officers would share their own concerns, their own struggles with the old system. "We needed someone to go first," one veteran cop told him. "You gave us that courage." New policies took shape, each one addressing problems revealed during the investigation. Clear guidelines for dealing with pregnant women, elderly people, and medical emergencies. But more importantly, real consequences for officers who violated these rules. The department installed new dashboard cameras and updated body cameras. But the real change wasn't the technology, it was the attitude. Officers began viewing these tools as protection, both for citizens and themselves. "When you're doing the right thing," their new trainer explained, "cameras are your best friend." Community meetings took on a different tone. Instead of angry confrontations, there were actual conversations. Officers attended in casual clothes, sharing coffee with residents, listening to concerns. The walls between police and public slowly started to crumble. The two officers from the incident faced their final disciplinary hearing. Their badges and guns had already been taken, but this was about more than punishment. Their case became a teaching tool, showing future officers exactly what not to do and why. Mr. Thompson worked with department leaders to create a new oversight committee. Half police, half community members, all committed to maintaining the changes they'd fought so hard to achieve. "We're not looking for perfection," he told them. "We're looking for progress and accountability." The high school where the teacher had recorded the incident started a new program. Students could meet with officers in a safe space, share their experiences, and learn about their rights. Some of these teenagers started thinking about becoming police officers themselves, but a different kind of officer. Local businesses noticed changes too. The same shops where people once felt watched and unwelcome now had friendly officers dropping by, greeting customers, becoming part of the community. "It's like they remembered their people first, officers second," one store owner observed. The police chief made an unexpected move by inviting Mrs. Lee to address the graduating class of new officers. Though still pregnant and cautious, she agreed. Her presence in the room was more powerful than any speech could be, a reminder of why these changes mattered. As training continued and new policies took hold, something remarkable happened. Officers started reporting problems themselves, not waiting for complaints. The culture of silence was breaking down, replaced by a commitment to doing things right. 3 months after that rainy day, the hospital hallway filled with the sound of a newborn's first cry. Mr. Thompson held his wife's hand as they welcomed their healthy baby into the world. Outside the hospital room, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, community members, and even a few police officers who had supported the changes. The retired surgeon, who had become a good friend of the family, brought flowers and a small teddy bear wearing a tiny police badge. "This one's different," he said with a smile. "It's a badge of honor, respect, and protection. Everything it should have meant all along." The police department's transformation had spread beyond their city. Other departments sent observers to learn from their new training programs. News crews interviewed officers about the changes. "It's not just about new rules," one officer explained. "It's about remembering why we chose this job in the first place." The whistleblower officer received a promotion to training supervisor. His first act was to create a program called Community First, teaching new recruits to see the human side of every encounter. The same teenage witness who recorded the original incident now helped with these sessions, sharing the story from a young person's perspective. Mr. Thompson's law office had changed too. What started as one case became a movement. They helped other departments create similar reform programs, but always kept the focus on people, not just policies. Every change we make, he often said, means another family won't have to go through what we did. The high school teacher who recorded the incident was invited to speak at the police academy graduation. "You're not just putting on a uniform," she told the new officers. "You're accepting responsibility for every life you touch." Her words became part of the academy's core training message. Mrs. Lee's story became a teaching case, but not just about what went wrong. It showed how one incident, handled properly, could lead to real change. New officers learned about it not with anger or shame, but as an example of why their choices matter. The community meetings continued, now with a different purpose. Instead of airing grievances, people shared stories of positive interactions with police. Officers brought their own families, played with local kids, became real neighbors instead of just authority figures. The baby's first checkup brought them back to the same streets where everything had started. This time, a police car pulled up alongside them. The officer inside smiled, waved, and asked if they needed any help with directions. It was a small moment, but it showed how much had changed. The former chief, now retired, visited the family one quiet afternoon. Holding the baby, he spoke softly about legacy. "Sometimes it takes our biggest mistakes to lead us to our most important changes," he said. "This little one will grow up in a better world because of what happened." Local businesses put up small signs in their windows, "Community Strong." It wasn't about taking sides anymore. It was about building something together, about turning a painful moment into lasting positive change. As the family settled into their new normal, they kept working for change, but now with hope instead of anger. The baby would grow up knowing both sides of the story, how things went wrong, and how people came together to make them right. 1 year after the incident, they held a community celebration in the park. Officers and citizens shared food, stories, and hopes for the future. The baby, now crawling and curious, became a symbol of what they were all working toward: a future where protection and respect went hand in hand.